Hello, everyone. This is the lecture video for the novel Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. Um, this, in my opinion, may be the toughest text of the semester. There's a lot of different things that this novel's doing, and a lot of different potential approaches, and a few different contexts that are sort of important to consider as you're working through the novel. I would really recommend, especially early on in reading starting up the novel, please give yourself the time to work with the material. I think that the novel takes some time to get used to it. And I think maybe especially the first part of the novel might just feel sort of confusing about what's happening or who's speaking. And so it takes a little bit of patience, and it takes a little bit more time just to get kind of acclimated to the text and how it works. But ultimately, I think it's a really sort of fascinating text in terms of its treatment of gender and identity, nurture versus nature, yeah, like power dynamics and economic dynamics and all sorts of and post-colonial materials. It's a really interesting novel. So there's a couple of quotes here. So the first is from the author herself, Riss. She seemed like such a poor ghost. I thought I'd like to write her a life. And then here at the bottom from the Paris Review, the novel didn't just take inspiration from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, it illuminated and confronted it, it challenged the narrative. So, what these two opening quotes are referring to is so the novel Wide Sargasso Sea, which was written in the 1960s, is partially one of the things that it's doing is Jean Rhys has gone ahead and written this novel in the 1960s as a sort of prequel, like an unofficial prequel to the famous novel from the 1800s, Jane Eyre. And so Rhys has gone ahead and created a backstory for what is essentially, I guess, the villain of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre novel, which predates Wide Sargasso Sea by like basically like 100 years. Yeah, give or take. And so this character that appears in the novel from the 1800s, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, the character of Bertha, she is this sort of ghostly, haunting, mad woman in the attic character that is essentially that essentially causes some challenges and stuff for Jane Eyre, for the main character of that novel. But what Jean Rhys does is she then poses a question of like, well, how did that woman end up in the attic? And how did she end up mad? How did she end up being this sort of strange, haunting ghost? How did we get here? And so then she writes this novel in the 1960s, giving that character a life and a backstory, and basically showing us, her version of then, or her take then, of how that character became who she was in the Charlotte Bronte novel. All right, so some opening things there. Let's keep going. So, this is okay, yeah, a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, yeah, from 1847. Yeah, so about 119 years before Wide Sargasso Sea. So this is a long quote from the novel Jane Eyre. And it's from the character Rochester, who we will see in Wide Sargasso Sea. So here he is. he is about, so this is a quote from Jane Eyre. Rochester is about to marry Jane Eyre when then suddenly the jig is up, and we find out about his previous mysterious marriage, and this to this woman who's been haunting the attic. And he says, "That is my wife." And he gestures towards, if you were to take a look on the screen here, he gestures towards Bertha, who is the sort of disheveled woman with the long hair. That is my wife. Such is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever to know. Such are the endearments which are to solace my leisure hours. And this is what I wish to have. And with that quote, he's gesturing towards Jane Eyre, the prim and proper English woman that you see in the image on the screen here to your left. This young girl who stands so grave and quiet at the mouth of hell, looking collectively at the gambols of a demon. And he's referring by demon, again, he's referring to the disheveled woman, and she is the demon. I wanted her just as a change after looking at that fierce rag out. Wood and Briggs, look at the difference. Compare these clear eyes with the red balls yonder. This face with that mask, this form with that bulk. Then judge me, priest of the gospel and man of the law, and remember with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. Off with you now, I must shut up my prize. And so this is Rochester comparing Jane Eyre to the mysterious woman in the attic. One is wild and fierce and has gone crazy and is disheveled and I guess sort of bulky, with these wild red eyes, whereas Jane Eyre is the prim and proper, quiet English woman. So we get this comparison of these two female characters, and it's the demon being described here that is then the essentially like the main character of our novel, White Sargasso Sea. Let's keep going. All right, so some basics here. White Sargasso Sea, Jean Ress. This is a prose fiction novel. The origin is of Dominican British authorship. So Jean Ress, is of British citizenship and Dominican citizenship. If you go through and look at some of the intro stuff that she writes, that's in the opening of your text, you'll see that she never really identified as British. She always found herself to be an outsider from the colonial islands, from the Caribbean. So from Dominica, and a small island in the South Caribbean, sort of, I would say a little bit closer maybe to the coast of South America a little bit, but a Caribbean island. So Jean Ress has this dual identity. She is British, but not really. She is really from the Caribbean territories of Britain, of the island of Dominica. The year of the novel, and that's a key thing in the novel and a key part of this unit, and I'm going to go through that in just a couple minutes. The novel is written in 1966, so we should keep in mind that this is during second wave feminism and women's rights movements that this novel is being published. So we should kind of keep that larger historical context in mind. Our two main characters, so we have Antoinette. She is a white Creole with family money. By Creole here, what we're referring to is a person of British citizenship, but she was born and grew up in the Caribbean. And so she is this of this mixed inheritance. And again, that's going to be crucial to how she is perceived in this novel, and ultimately is perhaps a driving factor of her fate and how she sees herself and how other people see her. And then we have the character in this novel of Rochester. He is never officially named Rochester in White Sargasso Sea, but we can essentially refer to him as Rochester. He is the character from Jane Eyre in this sort of prequel plot of him meeting his first wife, Antoinette. Rochester is an English nobleman, but he has no inheritance. He's essentially like a second son. So he has no money, he has no inheritance or estate, and so he is basically in a position of needing to marry into money. And Antoinette has that like family inheritance, but she's not English. She lives and was born and grew up in the Caribbean, and so she is English but not. She is Caribbean English. And that will, in the eyes of her husband, Rochester, that will always make her strange and odd and different and alien. All right, let's go, keep going. So this novel is taking place within the larger sort of context of what's called post-colonial literature. And so, here you have a map of major colonial powers in the world. So this is in the aftermath of, Europe colonizing the Americas, and then in the 1800s that rushed to essentially carve up Africa and parts of Asia. And so in the year 1900, so at the dawn of the 20th century, you see that the world is largely carved up among different European powers. And so Europe is in control of large swaths of the world, and these are their colonial possessions. But what happens, essentially after World War II, so beginning in the mid-1940s and then throughout the 1950s and 60s, essentially, those colonial possessions start to gain independence, and the original European powers, go ahead and retract and essentially, let go of those colonial possessions. And so post-colonial literature is then dealing with like the aftermath of that, the sort of like the dual nature then of and the sort of strange kind of identity crisis and power crisis that can emerge if you are living in one of those colonial spaces, and if you are from one of those colonial spaces, what does that then make you as a person? So it's part of this that Wide Sargasso Sea is participating in, even with, again, Jean Rhys. She is British, but she is like Caribbean British. And so then what does that make her in terms of her identity, her loyalties? How does she then really fit into into like Caribbean identity or British identity? So with post-colonial literature, this is literature that questions the imperial actions of European powers on the larger world. It examines the long-term effects of colonialism and post-World War II decolonization. How is identity formed after colonialism? How is power to be appropriately used once power is given back to native peoples? So this idea of how to then, construct power and political organization. So yeah, okay, identity, power, politics. With post-colonial literature, it examines issues of race and culture. It often examines culture clash and misunderstanding. And again, we're going to see that with with Wide Sargasso Sea. We have a little bit of a culture clash. Rochester is the English nobleman, and Antoinette is from the Caribbean, and that shifts and shapes who they are and how they interact with people. And we will see that it just doesn't match up. And with Rochester, especially when he sees his wife, he just simply does not understand her and who she is, and where she comes from. Post-colonial literature examines issues of power and control. When one culture has unquestioned power over another group, what does that mean? And so then here in Wide Sargasso Sea, that's going to get even further complicated along the lines of gender and marriage, and money. So Antoinette, she is of the Caribbean, but then and she has an inheritance. But according to British law at the time that this novel takes place, this novel is written in the 1960s, but it takes place like in the 1830s. In the 1830s, according to British law, once a woman got married, whatever personal wealth she had, transfers to the power of her husband. So we have here Antoinette as a woman, with an inheritance. But once she becomes married, she loses all power and control of that inheritance. So perhaps even think as a reader, to approach Antoinette as not just a single character, but as even perhaps maybe a stand-in, like a representative of colonial possessions of Britain, so to be a representation like of Jamaica or of Dominica. Yes, yeah, of Jamaica. And so to be sort of powerless and taken over by her British nobleman husband. These are stories that ultimately talk back to the ruling government and to the literary canon. So to question those actions of those European powers. And here's a quote from Rochester in part 2 of the novel. He's in the Caribbean with his new wife, and he's looking around him, and he says, I hated the mountains and the hills, the rivers and the rain. I hated the sunsets of whatever color. I hated its beauty and its magic and the secret I would never know. I hated its indifference and the cruelty which was part of its loveliness. Above all, I hated her, for she belonged to the magic and the loveliness. And she had left me thirsty, and all my life would be thirst and longing for what I had lost before I found it. And so here we have Rochester feeling completely foreign and separate from this like Caribbean landscape that he's in, and he then like essentially associates that landscape with his wife. They become one and the same for him in their like sort of foreign nature to him. Other plot problems, so the idea of identity. So within post-colonial lit, what is my identity in the empire after its fall? Where do I fit in this world? What or where is home? Who are my people? Think about this, especially when working with the character of Antoinette in this novel. She again is white and of British heritage, but she has grown up in the Caribbean. So she will never fit in Britain because of her background. But then a lot of the people that she has grown up with are not white British people, but they are natives to the land. And so they are natives to the land, or they are descendants, they are former or descendants of imported African slaves that were brought into the Caribbean to work those sugar plantations in early colonialism. So she is very often very different from other people of the Caribbean, and then yet she also doesn't fit in like in the UK. So then who are her people? Where does she belong to? And then in terms of identity, we'll see actually Rochester try to change the identity of his wife. And we see this quote, "Bertha is not my name. You are trying to make me into someone else, calling me by another name." Her name is Antoinette. At one point in the novel, Rochester will simply start to call her Bertha because he wants to. Think about this even just in remembering back to Orinoco and how Orinoco's name was turned to Caesar. Here we have that idea again of like identity and naming and power and how all of these things are interconnected. And then finally, at the very end of the novel here, we have a quote where Antoinette has really lost all sense of identity. She is now up in the attic. She is now the mad woman, wild and lost in the attic of the English house. There is no looking glass here, and I don't know what I am like now. I remember watching myself brush my hair and how my eyes looked back at me. The girl I saw was myself, yet not quite myself. Long ago, when I was a child and very lonely, I tried to kiss her, but the glass was between us. Hard, cold, and misted over with my breath. Now they have taken everything away. What am I doing in this place, and who am I? All right. So some complications here. Oops, oh, sorry. Context and complications. So again, this novel being written in the 1960s during a time of women's rights movements, but yet the novel takes place in the 1830s, and so so during a time when women had very little marriage or property or monetary rights. We're dealing with the idea of cultural assimilation between England and the Caribbean. We're dealing here with a little bit with a post-colonial response to the idea of the mad woman in the attic. This is a little bit of a literary character that we see in some modern literature. Perhaps you've had to read the short story The Yellow Wallpaper. Again, that deals with like the creation of a mad woman in the attic. If you haven't read that short story, it's quite short, and it's quite great. It's a little bit of a ghost story. It's a little bit of a psychological story. It's a feminist story. It's a power story. And it's a nice read as a comparative to what's happening here with Wide Sargasso Sea. And then again, this novel is a prequel to Bronte's Jane Eyre. This novel is largely formed along interior monologues, especially in part 2. Rochester's, sort of talking, or thinking to himself as he navigates his wife and everything. And we have some competing narrators here. In part 1, we'll have Antoinette as the narrator, and we'll see her in her youth, growing up in Jamaica. And so we'll see what kind of complicates her childhood and what kind of what builds her into the person that she is, and maybe what the fears that she has, and the things that maybe frighten her and shape her. So she'll be the narrator in part 1, and then part 2 is largely dominated by the Rochester narrator, with Antoinette sort of interrupting briefly a couple of times as narrator. And then we get into part 3, which is very short, and we're back to Antoinette. So here's the thing is, I mean, this novel's, sort of is focusing in on the early days of a marriage between these two people. By the end of the novel, those in power are going to decide that one of the people, that between Antoinette and Rochester, it's going to be decided that one of them is crazy, or one of them has gone over the edge and is no longer stable. And so with that, as you read, think about who you trust more as a narrator. And is perhaps the narrator who supposedly is the of sound mind narrator, is that the narrator that is actually maybe less, that you're maybe like less able to trust? So pay attention to the Antoinette and Rochester as narrators. Whose perspective are you more willing and able to trust as a reliable voice in this novel, and who's maybe keeping things from you, or twisting things, or ultimately shaping things in an unreliable or inaccurate way? All right. Lastly, some other things to consider as you move through this novel. So themes at play: identity, mixed identity, identity crisis, the idea of the other. So, with Antoinette and the Caribbean being this other space, this space that cannot be figured out, and then there's something threatening about that. The theme of slavery and abolition. So you'll see this throughout the novel, perhaps especially most overtly in the opening stages of the novel. The novel takes place right after the abolition of slavery in Jamaica. And so then there is this new power flux that's happening in Jamaica that Antoinette is sort of caught up in. And so how does that sort of shifting of power and slavery and freedom complicate like all of these relationships here? The idea of gender roles, gender power, and then psychological madness. So some themes at play. All right, so all of that sort of starts you up. We're almost to the end here, so be patient. But just a couple of things here. So as you move through the text, some questions to consider. So first up, like I said at the very beginning of this presentation, when you start to read the novel, simply take some moments to, to get used to the landscape and figure out what is happening in the opening of this novel. So you'll see that it's Antoinette as the narrator, and she is a child at the opening of the novel. And so then what impressions do we get of her experience as a child? What is her mother like? What is the relationship like between Antoinette and her mother? And then ultimately Mr. Mason, her stepfather. How do these things, do you think, influence Antoinette into her adulthood? How does the relationship that Antoinette had with her mother, how does that potentially then shape her actions as an adult? You'll see her mother repeatedly reject her daughter. And so then how does perhaps that rejection as a child steer her actions as an adult when she perhaps perceives her new husband rejecting her? And so how does that then maybe start Antoinette to panic and act the way she does as an adult when we move into part 2 of the novel? How do the early pages of the book set up identity politics of similarity and difference? How are characters categorized, labeled, viewed, and treated? So think about Antoinette and how she is treated by others on the island. Antoinette and her family, how are they treated by others on the island? How is she treated by other children? What names does she get called? And again, how does this all then potentially shape her as a character and as a person? And shape how maybe she sees herself. Although written in the 1960s, the plot takes place in the 1830s at the end of slavery in Jamaica. How does the novel express that shift in power and the racial tension that comes in its aftermath? And again, this will be most overtly sort of explored in the opening pages of the novel. All right, so that's some questions to think about when you move through the first part of the novel. When you move into part 2, the narrator will shift, and you will then be kind of like you'll Antoinette and Rochester are adults, and part 2 is largely from Rochester's perspective. And so with Rochester as the narrator, how does he describe Antoinette? What kinds of adjectives does he use? What does he focus on? What does he think of her? How does he perceive her? And perhaps like how does he perceive her like from the very beginning, like his first descriptions of her, and then how do they change throughout part 2 and evolve and become maybe more and more disturbing by the end of this by the end of part 2? Why have they married? What social structures and monetary laws are in place? Overall, what is the arc of the relationship in this section? What causes Rochester's feelings to change? And how is he describing her at the very end of this section? Look for the possessive pronouns and the ownership that takes focus towards the end of this narrative and his feelings towards her. Ultimately, how do we also see Antoinette slipping into becoming her mother across this section? What happens? What causes her to have a very similar fate to her mother? Think about that. What is her how in the end is her destiny ultimately very sort of mirroring the destiny of her mother? And then we have the character of Christophine, who is perhaps the third most important figure in the novel. In what ways is Christophine a central figure here and a threat to Rochester? So you'll see Christophine. So Christophine is a is a Black Native Caribbean. She is from Dominica. She is really Antoinette's main advocate and support system. She is the only one who is like really looking out for Antoinette. And here's the thing is Christophine is has her own home, has her own income, is not married, and is strangely respected and feared like by others on the island. And so she has this level of independence and power that you'll see like that Rochester feels like incredibly threatened by. Like he cannot sort of put his thumb on her. And so ultimately, how does he try to like perhaps assert himself? And what is their dynamic like when they have a couple of crucial conversations with each other? As the section ends, as part 2 ends, what is Rochester's plan for his wife? How does he speak of her? And then some final things here as you move into part 3, which is very short. Wide Sargasso Sea has 2 fires in it, one in the very first section and one in the last. How are these fires related? Who dies? Who falls into madness? Who is set free? How does Antoinette's experience of her mother's rejection shape her life? Is Antoinette like her mother? Could she have escaped like the madness of her mother, or is that madness inherited? Is it fated? Is she really mad? I think this is for me is ultimately like one of the perhaps like the key question of the novel. Ultimately, Antoinette will have the same fate as her mother. Was she always destined to have that fate, or was it simply that other people decided that she was destined to have this fate, and that's how she ended up there? Lastly, we get Antoinette and Rochester's perspective in the novel. What is the effect of reading from different people's points of view? What narrative voice do you trust more, and why? And that is, those are the last questions for part 3 and for the novel overall. Again, give yourself the time to work through this novel and keep these different contexts in mind as you read through the entire piece. Thanks for listening and happy reading.